Okay, so again, I am Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I wanted to share in the chat that I have my keynote talk, some resources for you at retrievalpractice.org/NRCSD. So there's a link to the YouTube video that some of you had watched in advance. Can you raise your hand if you did see that YouTube video, if you saw the keynote? Okay, great. So about half maybe. So this will be really fun to dive in more into retrieval practice and the concepts from my book, Powerful Teaching, and then also have time for some Q&A. So I'll give a little bit more background about myself, of course, and about some of the teaching strategies, and then we'll have time to dig into how you use these research-based strategies already, because great teachers do already. And what are some challenges that I can help you kind of troubleshoot through and make sure that we're really taking full advantage of these strategies. So I am a cognitive scientist. I've been conducting research on how students learn for 15 years, and I am also a teacher. I teach about 80 college students every semester. So I have 80 college students that I am so fortunate to teach at the Berklee College of Music. So I like to think about bringing together my love of the science of learning with my love of teaching in the classroom. And for some context, I think it helps to keep in mind who our students are. This is what my classroom looked like 2 years ago. About 40% of my students are English language learners. They're from all over the world. And I teach neuroscience and psychology at a music school at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. So if you recently saw Coda, can you raise your hand if you saw the movie Coda that won the Oscar? Yeah, so that's the school I teach at. Yeah, that they talk about in that movie Coda that just won the Oscar. So these are some of my students from 2 years ago. Of course, for many of us, this is what my classroom looked like for the past 2 years, and this is what my classroom looks like now. And so I have had a lot of the ups and downs. And of course, I could get very emotional about this in the past 2 years as well. But I will say that I think something really encouraging for me is from my science background, my background as a scientist and as a teacher, it's been really validating to see that some of these strategies we'll talk about, like retrieval practice, are flexible, whether we're in person, we're remote with our students, we're in grades 1 through 3 in early childhood, or we're teaching high school students, and whether we're teaching them language arts or music as well. So feel free as we go through to type into the chat your thoughts. You're also welcome to raise your hand on camera or unmute. I want us to just think back a little bit, and I mentioned this in my keynote, to what it was like when we were students. And maybe think about high school. We'll talk more about early childhood, but for right now, think about high school. For me, I often think about my own college experience. And if I had to study for an exam, you know, studying isn't always that much fun. I don't think students ever say that they love to study and do their homework. And then eventually before an exam, maybe we became kind of discouraged. I know studying in college was not really how I wanted to spend my time when it's nice weather outside or I can hang out with friends. And then we might start getting really discouraged. If you have a class in mind, I'm thinking of my college Greek mythology class. And there was just so much to memorize. And I just had a hard time studying for it. And eventually I thought, well, I'm cramming and this is really hard. And I would find out that I aced the test. I did really well. I did all that cramming and I did really well. And here you can unmute or type into the chat, but what happens the day after the exam or the week after the exam for you? You've crammed, you've done all this work, and then what? Type into the chat or just unmute yourself. What happens afterward? In one ear, out the other, right? You forget it all. And that is just one way, sorry, give me just a moment. And that's just one thing that happens to all of us, right? There's that oops feeling. And we know for more than 100 years of cognitive science that we remember stuff when we cram and then we forget it all. It doesn't stick right, Mary? And so one of my goals for my entire career is figuring out why doesn't that information stick? And of course, how can we make it stick? How can we help students remember? One way I put this with my college students is I want them to remember what they've learned beyond our 15 weeks together, right? I want them to remember beyond the semester, beyond the academic year. Otherwise, my students are spending a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of energy. And we as educators are investing so much of that time and energy only for students to forget everything. So how can we help students remember? There's this consistent cycle where students are frustrated and then we're frustrated. How can we get out of that cycle? Why is it that students forget? And from this research, we know that one of the reasons why is we focus on this first stage of learning that we call encoding. It's getting information into students' heads. And a key part of the learning process, when we get information in, you're encoding right now, students are thinking, they're active in class, whether it's early childhood, middle school, or high school, we're getting information into their heads. But what we also need to do is to focus on getting information out of students' heads. This process we call retrieval. To pull that information out of our heads helps students learn and helps them remember. And this is pretty intuitive, right? It's not new and we already do it. So we're going to talk about how we already do this and how we can spend more time on this retrieval practice. Another way I think about it is my music students. If my students have a performance, they have to practice. They practice their instruments, and in our classrooms, we need our students to practice their knowledge. Music students practice their instruments, and my students also practice their knowledge. It's the exact same type of practice. So I know I'm going through this a little bit more quickly, but again, if you'd like to take a look at the full keynote on YouTube, it's there. I just like to take advantage of our time together live, so we'll have more discussion. Just a few of the strategies that I mentioned in the YouTube video. One is that we talk a lot, or we often start our classes with, here's what we did in class today. Or here's what we did in class last time, or last week, or yesterday. That's just reviewing information. That's getting that information into students' heads. And there's this tiny switch that I love because it doesn't take any more preparation. No one likes more prep, and it doesn't take any more grading. We don't like to grade either, right? Is to just ask students to retrieve, what did we do in class yesterday? That's it. So instead of just telling students, here's what we did in class, is to just ask them, what did we do in class? And they could write it down, they could do a turn and talk, you could do a think, pair, share, which we'll talk about in a second as well. But that's it, just being mindful of how we start our classes. Another brief strategy I'll mention is called a brain dump. In the scientific literature, we call this free recall, but it's simply asking students to write down everything they can remember. So in Powerful Teaching, my co-author, Patrice Bain, she was a middle school history teacher for more than 20 years. And she would ask her students at the end of a unit on ancient Egypt to write down everything they could remember about ancient Egypt. And her sixth graders would write and write and write, and I got to hang out and observe them, and they would write for half an hour. And these sixth graders were so thrilled with how much they could remember. You could set sort of a hopefully not time pressured kind of check on maybe giving students 2 minutes. And I do this in my classroom, and then my students are still writing. So I'll say, how you doing? Do you want another minute? And they're all like, yep, because they like this retrieval process. It's a challenge, and that challenge is what improves students' learning. Another sort of simplified version of a brain dump is to simply ask students to retrieve 2 things. In my class, I asked students, what are 2 things you remember about our unit on childhood development? What are 2 things you remember about the book To Kill a Mockingbird? what are two things you remember about the process of mitosis and meiosis? This is really flexible. And again, it doesn't take any time or any prep. An additional challenge, you can ask students, like as an exit ticket, what did you learn in class today? What we call from the scientific literature spacing is simply to kind of space out retrieval practice. This is where forgetting is a good thing, kind of like, it's kind of like riding a bike, right? If you haven't ridden a bike for a while and then you ride it again, it's a little challenging, but it comes back faster. So as an exit ticket, you could ask students to retrieve, what did you learn today? Or you could ask them, what did you learn yesterday? Or what did you learn in our previous class? And that could still be an entry ticket or an exit ticket, but that's taking retrieval practice and adding this extra strategy called spacing. In our book, Powerful Teaching, we've got about 2 chapters on retrieval practice only, the research and more of these strategies. And then there's a whole chapter on spacing. There's a strategy called interleaving that I won't go into, but I hope you'll read about it, and a few other strategies. One more that I'd like to mention, could you raise your hand on camera if you use Think, Pair, Share in your classes? I see Carly does, Kieran, Paulina, Jackie, Jonathan, Victoria, Mary, Jose, great. I use it too. Here are my students doing a Think, Pair, Share. They wrote stuff down and now they're turning and talking, right? They think, they pair up, they share. What we often do is that we skip the think step. And that's where the magic happens. That's where students are retrieving. So we need to make sure we're not skipping that think step. I'm a big fan of just good old-fashioned paper and pencil. Have students write down their prompt that you've given them for Think, Pair, Share before they pair and share. And for my English language learners, because they've already thought in perhaps in their native language, taken the time to write something down, my ELLs feel like they are less on the spot. They've had more time to think and they're more engaged for the pairing and sharing. So make sure that you don't skip the think step. So those are just a few very quick retrieval practice strategies, but between a brain dump, 2 things, asking students what they learned in school yesterday, not skipping the think step, those don't require any grading. So often we think about when students are retrieving that has to be on an exam or a paper and it's an assessment, we have to grade it. Oftentimes retrieval is thought of as only a summative assessment. And retrieval practice is a learning strategy. It's not an assessment strategy. We do, as the teachers, we get formative feedback and our students get formative feedback as well. Because now it's a check on their understanding. Do they really get it? Or have they just been cramming? They get this feeling of confidence. I know it. I reread the textbook. I'm ready to go. But when students practice their instruments, they figure out, oh, wow, I need to do a lot more of this before my performance. And when students practice their knowledge, they find that they need to do this a lot more as well. And this all comes back to what I find so exciting is that your students will remember more. And we know this based on 100 years of research. I know this for my own classroom. Another benefit is that we don't have to reteach. How often do we start like the fall semester and a student says, I didn't learn that. And you yourself are thinking, right, Amanda, you are thinking, I taught you that. You know that, but you've forgotten it. And then we get stuck reteaching. If our students remember more, we actually save time. So we'll talk about in our breakouts a bit more. I recognize the challenge for retrieval practice is how do I do this, but still cover all my content? I'd encourage you to think about if students remember more, you can spend less time reviewing and less time reteaching. You can actually move on to newer content. So that's my kind of spiel with talking at you for the first 15 minutes. I'll share again in case you joined late. There's the link to the full YouTube video, to more resources. And what I would like for us to do now is to get more interactive and to hear your thoughts more than mine. So here's what I'm going to propose. And I'll show you how I do this in 1 minute. We're going to get into random breakout groups, and I love the size of our groups, so we can have a lot of great discussion. We'll get into random breakout groups, and I have some Google slides. Maybe you've done this in your classroom where everyone can edit them live. And you can join your breakout room when I open them up. If you'd like more of a Q&A with me, hang out here in the main room with me. So you have the option to join your breakout room or to stay here with me. So give me just a moment and I'll pull up these collaborative Google slides. And of course, if you have any questions in the meantime, do feel free to type them in or to raise your hand as well. So we're all familiar with Zoom land, right? So here's what the collaborative Google slides look like. I've already got the reminder there for you of the link, and each group has their own slide. And I just have simply written, what is one way you already use retrieval practice? Like I said, it's not new. There's a lot of new research backing this up, but you already do this, I'm sure. So in your group, you can literally, everyone should have editing access once I send you the direct link. And you can put in your names here. So let's say we've got Catherine and Brittany and Kieran. You can put in your names there. And then you can go ahead and type in the different ways that you already use retrieval practice. So has anyone used this or done this with your classrooms before? I see Brittany, Paulina have, cool. It takes a little getting used to sometimes, but I think it's pretty doable. So I will just share, oops, sorry. Let me get that link. So the retrieval practice link just provides kind of the resources. Here is the direct link to the Google slides. So it's bit.ly/North Rockland. And hopefully we'll see a bunch of people joining there. Yeah. And while you're joining there, I will set up the rooms. So we're going to be in nice small groups of 3. So again, you're welcome to stay here in the main room with me if you want to chat about the keynote or powerful teaching or anything. And or feel free to join your breakout room, come back to the main room. I'll give us about 5 or 6 minutes to think about how you already use retrieval practice. So group 1 is Brittany and Viviana. So you can find that group 1 slide. Group 2 is Crystal, Mary, Paulina. Group 3 is Jackie, Samantha, Victoria. Group 4, Carly, Catherine, and Kevin. Group 5 is Amanda, Jade, and Jonathan. Group 6 is Adam, Ashley, Paul. And group 7 is Andrew, Jose, and Kieran. So I will pause the recording.
Tell somebody movement-based practices and integrating movement into learning, because I do feel like I have certain kids who really benefit from that. I'm a counselor, but in terms of like SEL work, some kids don't find sitting still and doing breathing exercises to be very helpful. But if we integrate movement into it, some of them are more likely to participate and find it more soothing, you know, in a moment of stress. So I really like the idea.
Thanks, Viviana. Someone else, what's something cool you saw on your own slide or someone else's slide? You can unmute.
Yeah, just building on that, there's a lot of, I see a lot of songs and dances, which I think is great, especially some of us are lower elementary in here. Even, you know, the upper elementary or sometimes high school, you can play like a YouTube video or something and they can get into it. Also, I have on our side, we did mnemonics. So you can use things like that just to quickly get that retrieval from them.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to hop right back into breakouts. Did that go okay? Yeah. Okay. What I'm going to do is put us back into breakouts, but mix you up so that you get to chat with other people at North Rockland instead of just your group. And this time you don't need to edit the slides. You can just talk about some other things like Carly and Viviana shared, other things you saw on the slides, or continue to swap some strategies that you use. So I'm going to recreate the rooms so you can look through the Google slides, but you no longer need to edit them. So you can stay here in the main room with me again, or join your breakout for more discussion.
I'm unmuted now. Okay. So we actually talked about one that I wrote down, and my group members didn't really know about it. It's the carousel method. So in that strategy, you put up I have very large Post-it notes that kind of like stick to the wall. And for instance, we recently learned about the United States and the 3 branches of government. So on top, I could write, what does the executive branch do? And each group of students would go through different various questions that I had up. And for that question, one group might write the president's, the head of the executive branch. And as they rotate, different groups would add on to what that first group said. So depending on how many groups you have or how many students you have, they would add on or comment on to what other people said. So while they're retrieving the information, they might also be remembering other things that they've learned.
I love that. As they're retrieving, they're remembering more and more things, which is fun to see because then they light up, or at least then they're like, oh wait, I remember more and more. It becomes this fun snowball for them. Yeah. And actually, Samantha, can you share a bit about your thoughts? We had talked a little bit about that with the students that you were engaging in retrieval practice too.
Sure. I teach 8th grade resource room and study skills. So after the keynote that we watched on not the last faculty or staff development day, but the day before, the one before, I went back into Fieldstone. I was all jazzed, and my 7th period study skills, which is about 10 students, came in, and they were having a quiz the next day on finding the volume of a sphere. So I said, okay, everybody write down what you remember, and everybody, even the girl who like struggles the most with math, was able to write down at least one thing. Like she wrote down how to do something on the calculator, which was a big deal, like pressing the second function. And it's like, great, you remember that. So I collated all of their notes on the board, and they all took a picture of it so that they could use it as their little note sheet for when they took the quiz the next day. I was so excited for my resource room to come in the next period. And the 5 of them came in and sat down, and there was nothing. They could not remember one thing to put down on their note cards. And they were, I was just like really bummed afterwards. And that's the last period of the day. And I just walked out like, wow, that didn't go as well as I thought it would go. So that was my experience. And, they struggle to remember what they did. If they come in Monday, I'm like, what'd you do over the weekend? They struggle to remember one thing that they did over the weekend, some of them. So memory is a bit of a struggle sometimes.
Thanks, Samantha. Carly.
I actually was talking about that in one of my groups as well. So last year I worked in a co-teach classroom. I had students with disabilities, and sometimes I would tell them to brainstorm or think about, something as simple as Samantha said, talk about your weekend, and they would just sit there so frustrated. So I just kind of wanted to pick your brain and ask you, what are some strategies that we could use if our students are struggling with those brain dumps, or just sitting there kind of staring at the page rather than taking a bunch of notes?
Yeah, it's a really important question because students can struggle with this. And Samantha and I had the chance to talk more about this. One is to always try to remember that this struggle is a good thing for learning. And because we and our students are so used to, in some ways, used to kind of the fast, easy, engaging, choral work, that when students are struggling in silence, that can feel frustrating. And we call this a desirable difficulty. That difficulty is desirable. Having to struggle to think about it, to mentally travel, can be a little uncomfortable. It takes me a while to remember what I did last weekend too. At the same time, this is where you all come in, of course, with your creativity, your flexibility, your students best. So I can't really say, here's exactly how long to let students brain dump. Samantha and I talked about how you can kind of get a feel for, is this silence way too long for my students to struggle? Or am I just pushing the envelope a little bit? So we need to make sure we are giving them that time to struggle. Now, to Carly's question as well, what happens when they just can't remember much of anything. Jackie, I wonder if this comes into your carousel method. Sometimes with my students, I'll have them retrieve one thing on an index card, and then they pass them, or I collect them, shuffle them, and pass them back out with no names on them, not for grade. They just write down one thing, I shuffle them, pass them back out, and then I ask the students to write down one more thing. I collect them, I shuffle them, I hand them back out. And so it kind of works like that snowball, right? I've seen, one thing on this index card, I add something. Oh, brand new index card. Now there are two things. Now I can add a third thing. So it's almost like this collaborative retrieval, but each individual student is still retrieving. They can't rely on the kid who tends to carry the group projects, or the kid that tends to carry the group retrieval or discussion. And so I think that kind of scaffolding can be a nice way where students, I hope, aren't feeling anxious by the silence necessarily. It's not for a grade, it's interactive, and it provides some of those retrieval cues, that snowball feeling. Oh, we did talk about that. Here's another thing missing from the index card. And you all can judge, how many times to shuffle and rotate this around. What do you think, Carly, Jackie? Would that be something helpful in your classrooms? Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to spend more time in breakouts. I'm happy to hang here in the main room again. This time, if you go back to those Google Slides, if you still have them pulled up, and let me put this back in the chat again. So back to those Google Slides. Now, if you scroll down, I've got the slides with the colors of downloading free resources from my website, retrievalpractice.org. I've got the list of books and podcasts below that. I guess I can screen share. Below that now so right up at the first half, you wrote down how you already use retrieval practice. Now in the second half, you'll see I've asked, what is a challenge you've encountered? And so I'm glad that we already started that discussion, because some of this can be challenging. And so this way you all can talk through your classrooms in North Rockland, and then we can go to some more Q&A. So I'm going to recreate rooms again. And let's see, there we go. And so group one, that's slide 13. Group one, you're Jackie, Kieran, Samantha. Group two, Mr. Zolo, Catherine, Kevin. Group three is Andrew, Jose, Paul. Group four is Adam, Paulina, Viviana. Group five is Jade, Mary, Victoria. Group six is Amanda, Ashley, Crystal, and group seven is Brittany, Carly, and Jonathan. So I'll open the rooms. Hopefully someone in your group remembers your number, so you can find your slide and type in, what's a challenge you've encountered with retrieval practice? So we still have about half an hour left if you'd like to join for the whole hour and a half. Yeah. We're going to go until 6 o'clock Eastern. I'm in Boston. You're all in New York, I think. So we're all Eastern. Yeah. So until 6 o'clock. So we have half an hour left. I was wondering if each group would feel comfortable. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but so you've already retrieved. So you already have something to talk about. Is each group to maybe just share one of the challenges you've experienced? I noticed some overlap. So this is something I really like with these collaborative Google Slides, is I can look at all the slides too and see and pace sort of how breakout rooms are doing. But I'm wondering if we can just go group by group, and you can pick someone to share something that's been challenging. So group one is Jackie, Kieran, Samantha, Stephen. Samantha.
So one of the things that we found challenging is that the past 2 years, students really haven't had to engage in retrieval, at least not really on the secondary level, because a lot of the assessments that they've had were given at home. And so they were able to access iPads or Google or something while they were taking their assessments, and they really haven't had to retrieve much at all.
That's a helpful point. Thanks, Samantha. Group two, Catherine and Kevin and Mr. Zolo.
Yeah, this one's kind of specific to band maybe, but navigating the struggle is a good thing. But sometimes in band class in 4th grade, you hear the struggle and it can sometimes be difficult to listen to for long periods of time. but it is an important step. You have to go through that experimentation phase to really understand it. But when 30 kids are doing it at once, it can be quite a bit to navigate.
And to hear, like you said, to literally hear.
Yes. And I was just thinking back to what you said, what is a comfortable wait time to let a student answer? And I can't say I know everything, but I'm familiar enough with my students to know that there are some who just can't, I teach a class with mix between speech and language impairment and autism. And most of them are verbal, but a lot of the times I could say, what did you do yesterday? And they'll just say, yesterday, and they'll smile at me and I could ask again. And I don't, so the wait time, I can wait for certain students, but others, it's just not, and I was telling Kevin that I could also, I could put picture cards out. Let's say I know what they may have done yesterday. So it might be they played on the playground, played with their tablet, or played with something else. But a lot of times I might ask, what did you do yesterday? And they'll just label everything and smile at me and they'll just, point things out. So I have a difficult time with that, especially with the processing, and the retrieval.
Thanks for sharing, Catherine. I really appreciate that. Group 3, Andrew, Jose, Paul, what's a challenge you've encountered? Paul.
We talked about, we had a great conversation collaboratively. I'm a psychologist, they're two great educators. I think one of the challenges is trauma. I think that's a big one where, as we know, the research shows that trauma impacts our frontal lobes, right, which is part of our brain. So for children who, have been experiencing traumatic events and continue to, right, emotionally, physically, verbally, what have you, that's going to impact their ability to retain information within the short amount of time and the long amount of time. So, just the juuling and vaping and substance usage. And this district did a great job with the presenter that we had the other week talking about that. So that was another issue that also impacts the ability to sustain memory and be present in the current task in the teacher's classroom. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Jose?
Yeah, I was sharing, especially for retrieving, you also have that student that just might not want to participate. He don't want to share. He don't want to talk. He just, leave me alone. Why are you having me do this? And, sometimes I find that sometimes engaging in the topic or finding the interest might be a way to have them participate because, they might have it. They might have the pre-knowledge, but they just don't want to participate. Participation for them is not important.
Thanks, Jose. Participation may not be important and they may not be willing. Yeah. And of course, with the pandemic and with trauma as well, all of that can make it difficult. Viviana?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I'm in the next group, and just to tie into what Paul said, kind of in conjunction with that, because of the pandemic, there was so much interrupted education that sometimes that long-term retrieval has gotten impacted by so much that has happened in kids' lives. So those gaps are difficult and really have an impact on their ability to have those retrieval skills.
Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that. And yeah, I've seen that pop up on a number of slides. And so that's something common, that a lot of students are wrestling with, especially right now. Yeah, thanks.
When you think about it, we've had so many of our state assessments that have been canceled, whether it be Regents exam or these other high leverage assessments, which has called upon the students that is a necessity for retrieval. It's been for the past 2.5 years really put off. So interested to see results this year as we transition back to what resembles a more of a normal type scenario for the end of the year.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. Thanks. Let's see, next group, Jade, Mary, Victoria, group 5. Your thoughts, challenges?
So something that we said is at just being able to vocalize the information, because sometimes I think students can remember, but then just trying to get it out, and then oftentimes it takes like a lot of scaffolding to get them to access that memory. Like we have to do it chunk by chunk. An example I gave is that one of my students, they're creating their own quiz about ancient China that based on what we've been learning about throughout the unit. And
he asked me, he came to me, he's like, all right, Miss Al, what do I write? I said, you ask questions based on what we learned. And then he just like kept staring at me. So I said, okay, what do you know about ancient China? Again, he just kept staring at me. I said, okay, what do you know about the Silk Road? And then he was able to start speaking to me. So just like scaffolding and breaking it down bit by bit so they could actually access what we're asking them to accomplish, I think is a struggle for some of them.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. That's a really helpful example. It's what we, in the scientific literature, if it's helpful, it's what we call retrieval cues, literally to try to give students those scaffolded cues that hopefully sparks the ancient China too broad. Silk Road, that helps provide a cue. Yeah, so that scaffolding can be really important that I know a few of us as well were discussing. Amanda and Ashley, challenges, strategies you've encountered?
Yeah, so to kind of go off of what Jade was saying and yourself as far as the scaffolding, I noticed a lot, primarily in the beginning of the years, I have more struggles with, my students who are ENL or native Spanish speakers, where they're the ones that are more hesitant as well to be more reserved or maybe not want to, volunteer or give me the same, like, I don't know, or I played. That's what I get a lot of the time is like, I played. And I'm like, oh, well, what did you play? And things like that. So I think our sentence frames, and similar to what Molly was saying, like picture cards, especially for our ENL population, was very helpful for me. I'm doing second grade this year, but when I was doing first grade, I was really noticing in the beginning, it was like a lot of kids were hesitant, and it was the same thing. I ran. That's what a lot of my ENL kids would say. They said, I run or I ran. And I'm like, okay, so tell me more. So I think using those sentence frames to scaffold, like, this is what I remember, or this is, something like that, along with like pictures, can really help them. And we also talked about just in general, the having students, really to explain their thinking. It's difficult for some of them, if you're not giving them that scaffolding or extra tools or support to kind of guide them along that way.
Thanks, Amanda. And I realized yeah, thank you. That makes me think of a strategy I didn't cover in the keynote, but in our book, Powerful Teaching, we've got a chapter on metacognition. So the phrase like, that's so meta, metacognition, cognition of cognition is when students think about their own thinking, or they think about their own learning. So that reflection process you mentioned, Amanda, fits really well with some of the ideas we have about metacognition. And I think that link worked correctly. Jose and I were talking about how humans don't multitask, we multi-fail. And so I hope that link works. Yeah, so thanks, Amanda. And the last group, Brittany, Carly, Jonathan, how about your challenges, successes with retrieval?
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Amanda was talking about with her ENL students, because I was thinking about differentiation. You always have to differentiate throughout the day, and same thing goes with retrieval. All students are not going to retrieve the same way, and they're not going to respond to the same retrieval strategies. So we need to find the ways that work best for each individual student in order to cater to each of them.
And I'm going to jump off of what Carly had mentioned, because we also chatted about this in our group, and in an early group that I was in was also about not just making sure that we're asking the right questions by differentiating, that we're paying attention to who we are asking these questions to, and making sure that we are trying to build the confidence of the students. So if you're asking them a question that they're not going to be able to answer, they're not going to be able to retrieve that information, therefore feeling less confident and not willing to want to continue to progress. But as we talked about in our first group, it's about making sure that we're asking questions to students who we know can get the question right, so they start to feel the confidence, like, I can do this and I can do more.
Yep, I love that. And that makes me think of, I had heard this, I was kind of popping into different breakout groups. And like Brittany had said, one thing that I find so important is to model retrieval practice for us as educators. So we could start by saying, before even asking students, what did you do last weekend, is to ask ourselves, like, wait a minute, let me think about what I did last weekend. And then I legit have to struggle to think about what I did last weekend. And for students to see us struggle with that can be really helpful for us to model that ourselves. Another strategy I found that I sometimes talk about is how retrieval practice doesn't have to be a big deal, because we often think about it just in an academic context, and we forget that we do it all the time. So I have some friends who, like, every other sentence starts with, I heard on this podcast, blah, blah, blah. And that's just them retrieving in everyday life. Or, wow, there's this cool scene in Coda the movie. But I feel like the podcast one in particular is just retrieval in everyday life. And so I have a list of what I call retrieval warm-ups. You can download a PDF of these. And it's exactly what I asked when some of you were joining at the beginning, which is to just share your least favorite ice cream flavor. And by sharing your least favorite ice cream flavor, first of all, we kind of got to laugh and make some BFFs for those of us who dislike mint chocolate chip. But we all had to mentally retrieve maybe the last time we ate ice cream. And that's just retrieval. And so it takes some of that discomfort and stigma of like, you want me to do what? No, thank you. But if your entry ticket, if you have an entry ticket, could start with these kinds of, would you ever want to go skydiving? And then that might help a student think through. It sounds like, of course, students, none of them have gone skydiving if they're under the age of 18, but they're going to start retrieving other things. Or a fun question I like, even for my college students, is would you rather own a hot air balloon or a sailboat? And I find then students are retrieving the last time they were near water, or I retrieved my childhood in the Midwest. And so I love hot air balloons, or the idea of owning one, because then I could see everything. And again, that provides the modeling and examples where retrieval practice can just kind of be this warm up. So every week I do ask my college students these like random questions. Amanda?
So that made me think. I started doing something mid-year with my students. We use hand symbols when I do ask a question or something like that. They give like a certain symbol where it's showing me, like they just do it in front of their chest, and it's like, you know, when I need more time, or so that way they're not like having to feel embarrassed or anything. And they show like, one, I need more time. Another one is like, I have more than one answer. Another hand symbol is like, can you repeat the question? Things like that. So what you were saying just made me think of that. It's kind of a more discreet, you know, way to have them comfortably show, you know, what they want to share.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because again, there is that discomfort both in sort of a memory learning context of that mental time travel, and the discomfort of, I'm sure we all grew up in a classroom with that one kid just always answered, right? And so the rest of us are like, I don't know the answer, so I'm going to let that one kid answer. And so I like that, Amanda, that there are kind of these quieter ways of showing our discomfort with that struggle, right, and with that.
And it shows me like, okay, I know that one is, they're not just sitting there, but they're really still trying to come up with something for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 15 minutes left. I'll mention again that I've got resources here. Yep, so that's the link to the keynote and some downloads, and you can kind of play around through the website. I've got a lot of stuff in a lot of different areas. I wanted to mention that I do have free like 10-page guides written by scientists for teachers. And one of them is specifically on retrieval practice in early childhood education. So if you go to that link, retrievalpractice.org/library, it's the early childhood one, has kind of a purple, yeah, here, I have it here. It kind of has a purple cover. And you can download everything on my website. It's free. And so here's that retrievalpractice.org/library. And you can click right here to access the entire Google Drive of stuff. So the practice guides are here in a Google Drive folder. I've also got translations, which are awesome. So I hope you can share that. And then we've got some templates from the book. And I'm so excited again for your support in looking through and reading the book as well. Other questions? I'm happy to talk more broadly about other strategies, because we talk about in Powerful Teaching retrieval practice being a foundation. And then there are ways to make it even more challenging and more effective for students' long-term learning. So we can talk about that. Samantha and I had talked a little bit about student study skills. And with my college students, I continue to be surprised by the number of them that say that they have never thought about how they study. And they're already 18 to 20-year-olds, and they've never thought about this. So there are 3 questions I ask my college students that I think work really well with 5th graders, is how do you study? Why do you study that way? Did someone teach you, a parent, a teacher, or maybe you just kind of made it up? So how do you study? Why do you study that way? And then my favorite, does it work? And a lot of my students are like, kinda, because they recognize exactly what we talked about earlier, is that cramming works in the short term. They might do really well on a test, and in the long term, they forget it all. So just like we have to reteach, they end up restudying. It wastes their time, it's frustrating for them. So as part of this modeling of retrieval practice, I feel it's so key to also talk about learning. How do we learn? Sorry, I live in Boston, so you might hear the police car. How do we learn? That struggle is a good thing. It exercises our mental muscles. Let's talk about study strategies. This is kind of geared toward older students, but I have a list there, retrievalpractice.org/students, of blogs, podcasts, books for students to help them study more effectively. And then I've got links there about activities you can use with your students as well to help kind of normalize this, help students feel comfortable with retrieval practice and that productive struggle, that desirable difficulty. So I will, I guess, one more time, put us back into breakouts. And I would suggest talking about, I talk about in the book, this rose, thorn, bud activity that I cannot take credit for. Has anyone heard of this rose, thorn, bud activity? Oh, okay. I think people use it in a variety of ways in personal life, professionally, is just the idea of a rose, something that's going really well, a thorn, something not going that well. We've kind of already done that with our 2 Google slides. What are you already doing? What's not going so well? And then the bud is what's a new idea? So something budding, it's starting. What's a new activity you heard, a new idea you might have about how learning works, how to model it, a new bud about, wow, someone else has the same challenge you do. So I'm gonna put us back into breakouts again. I'm happy to stay here in the main room. If you'd like to talk with me directly and share, I'm just gonna recreate new, actually, I'll just keep us in the same rooms we were in earlier. So talk about your bud. What's a new idea, activity, modeling thought that you have?
I'm afraid to ask.
This meeting is being recorded.
Well, what I was most curious about was interleaving.
Mhm.
Because during our watch party, upon conclusion, I kind of led a work session with a group of teachers about that. But you started this by saying we're not going to touch on interleaving today. So I've been biting my tongue now for about 1 hour and 28 minutes.
Yeah, actually during the breakouts, Andrew and I were just talking about interleaving with robotics and tech. So you missed that conversation, but there's a link, retrievalpractice.org/interleaving. It's just intentionally mixing up similar concepts to help students compare and contrast. So again, intuitive, you might already do this. A simple example is if students are learning art history, is sometimes we might go through history chronologically. Let's learn all about Renaissance paintings, and then we'll learn about mid-century paintings, then we'll learn about modern Picasso paintings. And interleaving is just taking those different time periods and mixing them up. So if a student looks at a new painting, you can ask them, is this a Monet? Is this a Picasso? Is this by Da Vinci? And that helps students then take these kind of similar concepts and mix them together, as opposed to us teaching a unit and then moving on. Teaching a unit and moving on is to think about what are some concepts you teach that you can intentionally mix up for an added challenge. So it's that foundation of retrieval, and then kind of this extra boost is interleaving. That's a very simple example.
And we did speak about how the practice is often the one you described of teach the unit, capture the material, and then move on, leave it behind.
Right.
And that lends itself to cramming at the end.
Yeah.
Because at the secondary, when you're dealing with cumulative assessments, whether it's region exams or whatnot, all that content is just as important. And then you find yourself trying to go back in time and say, don't you remember when we talked about this on September 20th?
Yeah.
And, let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that is all of our time together, but thank you so much for spending your time with me on a Friday evening after parent-teacher conferences. Feel free to reach out. I will add the link to our Google Slides back onto the webpage for North Rockland. That way you now have your notes. You retrieved, you've got your notes together. I hope the discussion about your buds was helpful and connecting with colleagues from different schools and grade areas and content areas. So anyway, thank you so much for reading the book and being a part of the science of learning. Thank you. Mr. Zolo, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone have a great weekend. Rest up and I'll see you all Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank-